From Bowling Green State University and the Institute for the Study of Culture and Society, this is BG Ideas.
I'm going to show you this with a wonderful experiment.
You're listening to the Big Ideas Podcast, a collaboration between the Institute for the Study of Culture and Society and the School of Media and Communication at Bowling Green State University. I'm Jolie Sheffer, Professor of English and American Culture Studies and the Director of ICS. As always, the opinions expressed on this podcast are those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily represent those of BGSU or its employees. Bowling Green State University and its campuses are situated in the Great Black Swamp and the Lower Great Lakes region. This land is the homeland of the Wyandot, Kickapoo, Miami, Potawatomi, Ottawa, and multiple other indigenous tribal nations, present and past, who were forcibly removed to and from the area. We recognize these historical and contemporary ties in our efforts towards decolonizing history, and we thank the indigenous individuals and communities who've been living and working on this land from time immemorial. My guest today is Dr. John Dowd, who joins us as an ICS Faculty Fellow in fall 2022. John is an associate professor in the School of Media and Communication here at BGSU. He teaches courses in communication, specifically communication ethics and rhetoric. His ICS Fellowship project was titled AI and Everyday Life, Finding Our Footing in Contemporary Digital Society. Thanks for joining me today, John.
Thanks, Shirley.
Will you describe for us some of the research you've been working on during your fellowship period with ICS?
Yeah, I've been looking a lot at the role of artificial intelligence, or AI, in everyday life and the ways in which it has increasingly been, I hate to use the word infiltrating, but slowly creeping into more and more aspects of our day-to-day experiences.
For those who aren't familiar, could you explain a little bit about some of sort of what we mean by AI, what's included in that term, and some of the ways in which it is, in fact, shaping our experiences?
Absolutely. Yeah, and that's actually when I started looking at that and thinking about it, I was quickly made aware of how complicated that question actually is. I assumed that I knew what it was, and the more I started reading about it, the less I knew about it. So I think this is a helpful way of kind of parsing it out. There are a few different definitions that we can kind of look at and unpack more if we want to. The typical industry definition would be that AI is a set of technologies, computer technologies, that attempt to mimic the problem-solving and decision-making capacities of humans. That can be further broken down into both strong and weak AI. To be kind of clear about those two, what we experience when we talk about AI or when we're interacting with AI now, currently, is all weak AI. What we refer to when we talk about strong AI is what people also call AGI, or artificial general intelligence. And that would be sort of the science fiction version of AI, Skynet.
HAL
HAL, yeah, and
Yeah.
all the other, the ex machina robots
Okay.
that would be running around terrorizing us and taking over.
And by weak AI, is that things like chatbots that you might use on a website to, answer FAQs, that sort of thing?
Yeah, I mean, and I think, we can unpack some more examples of this as we move forward. But everything from search queries, chatbots, when we access our entertainment on Netflix and Amazon, when we go online to shop. And there's a whole variety of different ways in which we interact with these technologies, and of the weak variety. The alternate definition that some people are pointing out, and I think is important to consider, is that AI is a marketing concept that's used to kind of push and hype technologies and data-centric techniques to sell a whole range of products and services that are sort of obscure from transparency and scrutiny.
What drew you to this topic as an area of interest? Like, how did this evolve out of your previous research?
Yeah, I had always been interested in science fiction, so there was that sort of natural pop cultural interest that I had, and that was more of a positive interaction with the idea or concept of AI. The more and more I started to learn and read and study, the more and more I learned about the harmful impacts and some of the problems within the industry itself and some of the histories of Silicon Valley itself, and the racist histories, to be quite clear. And so I started looking more closely and deeply into those issues and questions.
Well, and some of the things I think you're referring to, maybe you could speak a little more to this, are the ways in which we sort of have this fantasy that the AI is this objective and neutral alternative to human bias, when in fact, of course, it reproduces the biases of humans. And we've seen some egregious examples where kind of the calibration of image recognition sees dark skin and doesn't recognize it as fully human or things like that. Is that kind of what you're talking about?
Absolutely, yeah. And again, I think, I'm happy that you brought that up. And we can talk more deeply about that as it arises, or we can touch on it now. I think, when we start to talk about the language of AI and some of the concepts, I think there can be a challenge, and part of the roadblock that we run into is getting bogged down sometimes in technical discourse. Now, I think it's important to be able to make distinctions between some of the concepts and tools that we're talking about. But do I think it's necessary for people to be able to know how to code in order to critique the systems that they're experiencing on a day-to-day basis? I don't think that's necessarily the case. We should be able to kind of think about it in a broader sense and be open to different ways of talking about it rather than just in the technical domain. I think two discourses in particular, and again, we can pause with that or unpack it a little bit more, are the discourses of neutrality and determinism. So I'm glad that you brought up the first discourse there, and that kind of idea that suggests that these are simply tools, that they're not harmful in and of themselves, that they can be used for good or for harmful purposes. But I think there's a little bit more nuance to that, right? There are biases both in terms of the negative racial and gender-based biases that we talked about, but also biases from a media ecological perspective that we can touch on. The other discourse, I think that's important to kind of broadly frame the conversation is that of determinism. And that's, discourses of determinism have long been closely correlated with discourses of progress. Right? So this idea that technology is naturally and inevitably marching in a particular direction, and there's no point in trying to stop it or to put the genie back in the proverbial bottle. And so that can sort of instill a false sense of a lack of agency, right, that we want to kind of push back against.
Your work highlights the importance of having accessible language surrounding AI and data analytics. Since AI's recent rise in popularity, we've heard terms like neural networking, deep learning, machine learning, but these are really advanced ideas that may not always be clear to people exactly what they mean. And I think it sort of gets back to what you were saying about the more jargony or tech-focused we are, people just sort of opt out or feel like, oh, that's not for me, that doesn't affect me, that's that's for a coder to figure out. So what would you like to see happen around the language we use to talk about AI and algorithms and these concepts?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of the advantages that sort of I had when coming to this issue myself is that I was coming to it as a non-specialist, a non-expert. So I think a lot of the imposter anxiety, a lot of the trepidation and feelings of insecurity in approaching some of these very oftentimes complex and technical ideas, I'm experiencing those same things that I think the general population often experiences. And so that sort of helped me gain a kind of perspective with, okay, well, how can I get a handle on this? I'm supposed to be talking about this to others. What are some kind of ways of thinking about this, of talking about this that will help me understand them? And then in that process, potentially could potentially help my students or help other people sort of understand it. Media ecology has been central to that process for me. If we talk about one term in particular, you mentioned early on in the discussion that these technologies are extensions of us. And that is a very media ecological idea, right? They are extensions of some human process or capacity, but they are also extensions of existing ideologies and ideas, right? I think bias is another important term that we can think about, and that's something that I've used quite often. So we have bias in the traditional sense, right? These ideas of implicit bias. But in media ecology, we also think about bias as a set of characteristics that are somewhat innate to a technology or media themselves, that don't overly determine how they're used or the effect that they have on an environment, but they make certain behaviors make more sense than others. So if I could provide a quick example of that and then talk about some key biases that I think that are at play with a lot of these technologies, I think that could be useful. So one example that I often give to my students is when I was in grad school, first thinking about these ideas, I was in a pub having lunch, and there was a big window, and I was watching. I watched a car drive up, and there were two young women that got out, and they pulled out their phones when they got in, sat down. They smiled at each other, and then they, for the next 45 minutes, proceeded to play on their phones. I honestly am not exaggerating when I say that they did not exchange one word between each other for 45 to 50 minutes. At the end of that time, they put their phones away, looked at each other, nodded, and walked out and drove away. I presume they knew each other and came there together. And so, I kind of asked my students to think about, well, what happened there, right? And just to kind of get at, trying to think about the relationship between the technology and human behavior. And so we could ask, well, did the phones make them behave that way? And if so, what are the implications of that? Or was it that they had certain beliefs or behaviors, they were just kind of rude or indifferent, and so therefore they were just using the technology in a particular way. So in those cases, notice how those explanations both demonstrate discourses of determinism and neutrality, right? So I think it's, somewhere in between, when we say that there are biases inherent in the media themselves, or that the media are environments, what we're saying is that we are living in the environment of the smartphone. And within that environment, certain behaviors make more sense than others. Prior to that technology, it would have been very awkward and strange to see two people come in together and not exchange words and then just leave, right? But with the smartphone, we understand that behavior, right? And so trying to make sense of what that means for human relationships, interpersonal communication, and society at large, I think are important questions for us to think about.
We're going to take a quick break. Thank you for listening to the Big Ideas podcast.
Question. Answer. Discussion.
If you are passionate about big ideas, consider sponsoring this program. To have your name or organization mentioned here, please contact us at ics@bgsu.edu.
Hello, welcome back to the Big Ideas podcast. Today I'm talking to Dr. John Dowd about the role of AI in our lives and the need for accessible language about technology. We've talked about the understanding of complicated concepts in AI. Could you talk a bit about the ethics of AI in our lives? And, where are we now? And what are some ways maybe we should be rethinking the role of ethics in technology?
Yeah, ethics need to be a central concept in the design and use and distribution of technology, particularly technology driven by AI. But we should also ask, ethics are contested, as they should be, and whose ethics are we talking about, right? Because there is a lot of public-facing ethical principles being put forth by companies, and I imagine it's a lot like what I read about a lot of DEI discourse, right? That there's a lot of talk about the importance and the need for DEI work.
And by DEI, you're referring to diversity, equity, and inclusion
Absolutely.
practices. Yeah.
Thank you. And yet that doesn't necessarily always translate to action, right? And we know that ethics without action, right? In fact, the way in which I understand ethics, ethics implies action, right? Ethics for me, a working way of thinking about ethics are, the ways in which we are or are not enacting the moral values that we claim to uphold. And so, it's not enough to just say, we care about your privacy, or here are some of the things that we plan to do to keep you safe, right? We need to, I think, center the concerns and the well-being of people who are most disproportionately impacted, harmfully impacted by these technologies. And often those are individuals who are already, individuals and communities who are already marginalized within society.
Could you give some examples for that? Because I think part of what you're talking about are like with data privacy, right? Like how we are giving away so much data about ourselves all the time, and how that can connect with police surveillance and other kinds of monitoring that are not equally spread out.
Yeah, let me list a few, and then let's unpack some of those, right? I think we've got examples of predictive policing, right? So if people are familiar with the Minority Report, right, this story of the precogs, right, who are predicting crimes before they happen, that is actually occurring in many communities. Only we're using AI-driven systems, credit score monitoring. Access to resources, public resources, and when I sort of came across, the ways in which employers not only could but were actively monitoring and surveillancing their employees through office tools that we use on a day-to-day basis, I shouldn't have been surprised or caught off guard, but I couldn't help but be. There are also, on an entertainment level, right? And this will get back hopefully to this question of a set of biases that I think are really kind of guiding a lot of these practices, and we can hopefully scoop back to that later. But Ring doorbell. I believe owned by Amazon.
Yes.
There is talk that Amazon is in the process of creating a reality television show that uses camera footage gathered by Ring doorbells delivery drivers and people are already, surveillanced and monitored to an extensive level already. But this, takes it to, a level of mockery and dehumanization. I can only imagine. I mean, it's not far of a stretch to imagine what's going to happen. There's, it's going to show people treating people's property poorly, right? It's going to show people falling over into bushes and humiliating or compromising situations, all of this sensationalism that comes with that. And that content is being delivered or created directly from the data taken from Ring doorbells, a product that many people utilize in their daily lives.
And it's products like that people use for one purpose and don't realize that the data that is scooped up, they are relinquishing their rights to it in accepting the products,
Absolutely.
right? And this is true of what, like Nest thermostats, Roombas, vacuum cleaners. There are certain kind of smart mattresses. All of that data you lose control of as soon as you accept the terms of service.
Yeah, I mean, something that that I'll do occasionally is just kind of ask people, to pause and think about, all of the different smart devices that they are either wearing or that are within intimate distance of them on a regular basis. And it takes a little while, and sometimes, oftentimes they will be quite surprised to recount all of the different technologies that they themselves have purchased and that use. And then when you see them make the connection between, what these devices actually do and what they can do, I think there's a little bit of a wake up there for many of us. I know there was for me. A lot of these, these technologies, I mean, if we can unpack some of them a little bit more, I mean, predictive policing in particular is really problematic. We talk about, black box AI in terms of the technical aspect, but there's also the element that many of the municipalities and institutions that are utilizing this technology, even if the designers and technicians understand how it works, the people that are purchasing them and implementing them don't. Most of the time, what we find, we don't really have clear numbers on how many police departments are utilizing this technology, but we know that it's increasing. And the way these work are really disturbing and problematic. There was a lot of research and reporting on a system utilized in Chicago where they would use AI predictive software to generate potential criminal lists with names of individuals, and the police would knock on these individuals' doors prior to them even committing a crime, and they would be told that they're being watched and, we're paying attention to this. There was the incident, I forget the gentleman's name, but several years ago with the facial recognition software. This was up in Detroit where he was wrongfully accused of a crime. He was brought in, being interviewed by the detective, and said, "This clearly is not me." And the detective wouldn't believe him. He said, "Well, the computer says it's you." Being the degree to which people are being gaslit, by these technologies when we're letting it override our own very common sense as to what we know to be a certain case.
Well, and these practices existed before the technology as well,
Absolutely.
right? I mean, it's basically, when you talk about policing, it's the practice of sort of over policing certain communities. And the more, if you bring police there to focus, they will find more crime. Doesn't mean there's
Absolutely.
actually more crime relative to the population than in the white suburb next door.
Absolutely.
But if you draw attention to it, of course, you're going to find the thing you're looking
Of
for.
course, yeah. The more heavily policed an area is, the more stops are likely to be made, right? There is the expectation that gets created that some crime is going on there. Not to mention our own implicit biases about who commits what kinds of crimes and where. Again, these are extensions of existing biases that have existed for a long time. I mean, this idea of the criminalization of blackness, right, that Khalil Muhammad talks about in his amazing book, starts with the emergence of statistical analysis and social sciences to begin with, right? So it makes diabolical sense, right, that the technologies that are heavily dependent on mathematics and statistical prediction to sort of take these to a whole new level, right? So again, the shock, we should constantly be shocked at this stuff, right? We don't want to lose our ability to be shocked at this. But more of the amazement is at, not that it's happening, but at the scale and pace at which it's capable of happening now, given these new technologies and the sheer amount of data that's being collected on a daily basis, both voluntary and involuntarily.
And the kind of, I think a lot of folks just sort of assume or hope maybe that data is going to make them safer, right? When in fact, that is not necessarily the case, right?
It's not necessarily the case. I wonder, there is some interesting psychology going on here, right? And I was reading about the phenomena of people. Essentially, the argument was that people who live in more homogeneous societies tend to be more supportive of social benefits. But when those societies become more diverse, then all of a sudden social benefits are a crutch and we don't want to support them, right? I wonder if there's something similar going on with this idea of surveillance and data collection, right? Where, when we feel more safe and comfortable, we're less worried about surveillance and technology. But when, we are in a situation to where we are frightened by the other, right? Then we think that these technologies are an easy fix for these inherent fears that have been stoked for a long time.
One of the things that has come up a lot recently is the negative mental health effects of social media, but really it is about the algorithms, right? I'm thinking about the studies on Instagram, on the the self-image of teenage girls. Could you talk a little bit about where you see kind of mental health and AI and algorithms intersecting?
Yeah, in fact, more recently I've been writing a little bit about the relationship between media, social media, digital media, and loneliness. There's a lot of studies that are, again, the old cliche that correlation is not causation, but there are some pretty compelling correlations between the rise of these digital platforms like Facebook and Twitter and now Instagram and some of these other platforms. As these technologies become more widely used, we see a concomitant rise in feelings of depression and loneliness, feelings of isolation. And so, I think it's, again, we don't want to assume that there is a direct causal link between the two, but it's hard to ignore that there's not a relationship between the two.
Could you tell us a little bit about your community engagement work with Bowling Green High School students this semester?
Yeah. I'm working with Dr. Jo Beth Gonzalez, who is the director of the Bowling Green High School theater class that she teaches. And essentially, our particular project is focusing on questions of technology and the experiences of teenagers who are on the front lines using this technology themselves. And so I've been working with them, kind of thinking through some of these issues, talking about some of the concerns that they have, and they will be sort of utilizing some of that knowledge and information, putting together a short performance that highlights some of the tensions involved in these discussions, and we will be, I will not be performing it, I hope, and they will be performing it at Way Public Library, I think in December 3rd or 7th, somewhere. We'll clarify.
And what are you hoping that they take away from this collaboration?
Well, I think what I hope that they take away from it is the same thing that I take away from it, which is perspective. I think, the older I get, the further away I get from the experience that they're having. I know I have my own personal experiences in relationships with technology, and they are not entirely different, but certainly the lives of teenagers growing up with this technology is in many cases radically different than my own experiences. So I hope that they sort of garner a sense of understanding about the technology and respect for it in terms of this false idea of it being a neutral tool. I hope that they can learn to develop healthy boundaries, between themselves and the technologies that they use, and not feel so much tethered to it as they may, right? The sense of the FOMO that often gets experienced by people that aren't fully participating in these technologies.
I know that group does a lot with peer-to-peer conversations, right? And developing, part of the theater work is often kind of developing short performances designed for their peers that are kind of educational as well as entertaining. What are you seeing from that conversation about the ways peers are talking to each other about how to create maybe different kinds of boundaries or to think differently about their use of social media?
Yeah, I think one of the biases inherent in our digital environment is this idea of rapidization, right? Our experiences of time have, I think, radically changed in some cases. And so it can be difficult to pause and to take a step back. And we often get caught up in the moment, right? I mean, think about, and I don't think it's unsurprising that many of the technologies that are being developed now are designed around the short creative burst, right? I can only speculate that more that future technologies are going to be similar, right? Predicated on a shorter attention span.
Well, and thinking about like social media, the way those algorithms work is they prioritize the most recent posts. So you truly are missing things if you're not checking it all the time.
Absolutely. And they are personalized, right? I mean, this idea that, this notion of personalization, I think, is a very powerful one. And it's a marketing ploy, right, built on the idea of engagement, right? The more that we can engage things, the more that we can relate to you, personalize things for you, the more ideally you will be likely to purchase our product, service, or idea. And we see some of this, moving over into the political realm as well. I think we're all going to have to sort of deal with the impacts and consequences of this, but certainly, younger kids, adolescents, children whose brains are still developing, I think are more susceptible in different ways, not because they're incapable of enacting some form of agency, but again, neurologically, there is some developmental stuff that's different than adults who have, some of us, right, have had the opportunity to cultivate more experience in life and sort of have a greater context for some of the experiences that we're having online.
Well, and I think too about it's really sort of unprecedented. This is a generation that they are the experiment, right? That like they have from birth been exposed to technologies that for older folks, they were adults or young, older people before those were introduced. So they did have a before and after. And yet we've had a generation that we've treated them as guinea pigs by introducing them to these tools at really young ages.
Absolutely. I mean, I think we're all guinea pigs, and I mean, literally, we are being experimented on. And this was around the time of the Cambridge Analytica scandal in Facebook, where we discovered that they were actually manipulating people's news feeds, right, to see if they could generate different affective responses. And as diabolical as that sounds, it is. But it was, it was also banal, right? It was to see if we could personalize ads in such a way that would make an introvert, more likely to buy our product. Can I create an ad for the same product that is different for an introvert than a perceived extrovert? And it was really kind of circulating around a lot of those marketing tactics and ideas.
What would you like our listeners to take away from your research this semester? Any advice or recommendations for folks who might listen about what they can do to be more informed, more engaged, more maybe aware of the role of AI and algorithms in their lives?
Yeah, I think be open to a lot of the work that is currently being done, and I will sort of highlight some of that work. I think, one project in particular that I am, happy to sort of report on deals with the idea of consentful tech practices, right? And this is a project that was spearheaded by Una Lee and Tawana Petty for the Consentful Tech Project. And I think it started in Detroit, but they created a great curriculum designed around this idea of consentful tech, which advocates for consent and data privacy and safety to be built into the front end of technological platforms, rather than an example would be an opt-in ethos rather than an opt-out.
And can you just briefly explain for folks who maybe aren't quite thinking about what that means? What's the difference? What the current default is opt-out, which means what?
Which means I download an app and I am agreeing to the collection of any numerous data points that is stipulated within the legal agreement by the company. And I am automatically signed up for that. Sometimes the process for opting out of that is laborious and complicated and confusing. They make it as difficult as possible to opt out. And a lot of times people just sort of resign themselves to, ease and convenience. This is the challenge. Those very things that technology purports to assist us in, which is frictionless access, right? Technologies of ease and convenience. This also, I think, makes us a little bit more susceptible to not sort of taking a step back and sort of thinking about some of the things that we're actually exposing ourselves to in that process. So the opt-out feature is we are automatically enrolled in those agreements, and we have to actively go in and change those settings ourselves.
And that's also an example of kind of putting the onus on the individual as
Absolutely.
opposed to the system level.
Absolutely. We've given you the opportunity to opt out. We've done our legal part, right? If you didn't do that, that's on you. You should have read the 534-page agreement, user agreement, right? Whereas the opt-in ethos would be, here are all of the pieces of data or the collection of data that we would like to take. You can choose to allow us to do that or not before you even sign up for the product or service, right? And make that as seamless and as frictionless as possible. And so they're doing a lot of great work with that. Joy Bolamwini, who sort of spearheaded this work on facial recognition and the biases involved in that, it was actually her dissertation project that sort of recognized the problem with recognizing faces of darker skinned people, particularly darker skinned women. And she sort of spearheaded I think it's the Algorithmic Justice League, right? And she talks about inclusive coding. And she asks sort of three very important but related questions. I'll put them in statement form. Who codes matters, why we code matters, and what we code matters, right? So this is sort of involved, again, on the design end, rather than trying to mitigate all of the harm that's happening after the fact, right? Having more inclusive coding teams on the design end, also being more responsible in terms of curating data that we are training these systems on, so that rather than just dumping the entirety of the 9 rings of hell of the internet into these models to spit something out and then be surprised when it starts making racist or sexist claims, we should sort of slow down and sort of curate that data much more responsibly and inclusively.
Thanks so much for joining me today, John. It's been a pleasure talking with you. Listeners can keep up with ICS by following us on Twitter and Instagram at ICS BGSU and on our Facebook page. You can listen to Big Ideas wherever you find your favorite podcasts. Please subscribe and rate us on your preferred platform. Our sound engineers for this episode were Randy Kyle and Marco Mendoza, with audio editing by Deanna McKeegan and Marco Mendoza. Research assistance was provided by Ellie Dapkus, with editing by Joe Alaya.